Doctor-assisted death is not a slippery slope. It is a moral cliff. For the Colson Center, I'm John Stonestreet. This is Breakpoint. Writing a couple weeks ago in the Washington Post, prominent columnist George Will described the heart-wrenching account of a 29-year-old California man who's dying a slow and agonizing death from cancer. The man's wife has been documenting his painful decline through photos. In his column, Will argued that it would be better if this man had obtained a medical suicide, and he praised states like Oregon that make this option available to patients. In Will's ideal world, medical aid in dying would be available for all terminally ill patients, not for truncating an unhappy life, he clarifies, but for preventing a hideous death. In his article, he hopes to distinguish between a world in which doctors hand out suicide like candy and one in which people already in their final days can obtain a swift and peaceful end. Now, this modest-sounding proposal is obviously motivated by compassion. However, compassionate motives cannot make something morally right, nor can they prevent horrifying abuses of human dignity. If the ideas are bad, there will be victims. Good intentions won't stop that. Doctors killing their patients, even when those patients request death, is something that fundamentally alters medicine. Everywhere it's been tried, the weak and vulnerable have been endangered, the medical profession has been corrupted, and family relationships have been poisoned. In places like Oregon, in which doctor-assisted death was legalized on arguments from stories of unbearable physical pain, like that story told by Will in his column, a significant number of patients end up choosing death for psychological factors instead. Will, however, dismisses all these concerns. Life is lived on a slippery slope, he wrote. Just because we can imagine ways that medical aid in dying can be abused doesn't mean that it will be. But doctors killing patients isn't so much of a slippery slope as it is a radical altering of the medical landscape. It's a sheer drop off of a moral cliff. And it's not guesswork if we actually have the trial runs to prove it. For example, in countries like the Netherlands and Belgium, where physician-assisted suicide has been legal for decades, the acceptance of doctor-assisted death has led to euthanasia, the killing of patients who don't request death. Ryan Anderson, president of the Ethics and Public Policy Commission and formerly of the Heritage Foundation, thoroughly documented this in an in-depth report he wrote back in 2015. Government surveys in the Netherlands uncovered thousands of cases in which doctors intentionally administered lethal injections to patients without a request. That included children, the demented, and the mentally ill. Now, that progression from a death on demand to a death at doctor's discretion makes a grim kind of sense once the original premise is accepted. As Justice Neil Gorsuch noted before he was on the Supreme Court, physician-assisted suicide always relies on the physician to make the fatal decision. The patient can request to die, but the doctor's still the one who determines whether or not the patient's competent and eligible. It's a small wonder that wherever medical aid in dying has been legalized, doctors and lawmakers quickly begin to ask why a patient's permission is even required before exercising compassion on them. The arguments for medical aid in dying lead so quickly to euthanasia. One legal scholar quoted by Anderson chides any of his fellow advocates for a certain lack of courage in not admitting what their ultimate aims actually are. You see, once death is a treatment option, and I put treatment in quotes there, patients can no longer trust their doctors, their insurance companies, even their families to have their best interests at heart. A category like terminal illness is quickly broadened to include intolerable suffering, and that is quickly broadened to include mental suffering. As the medical bills pile up and family members whisper in the halls, patients themselves begin to feel that their right to die has become a duty to die. And that's why so many of the patients say that they choose suicide out of some sort of psychological distress. Yet, as Anderson points out, there's always alternatives to the corrupting practice of medical suicide. For example, a renewed investment in hospice and palliative care. These are options that affirm human dignity and mortality while not asking doctors to become executioners. While none of these alternatives make death easy, what they do is respect the sanctity of life and the precious relationships that make life worth living to its natural end. If compassion is truly our goal, we need to think long and hard about those values. And we need to consider the consequences for societies that leap into medical suicide with nothing but good intentions. For the Colson Center, I'm John Stonestreet with Breakpoint.